Hello and welcome. Today I'm sharing with you a few thoughts I've had about what could be next for the Superpockets from Blaze Entertainment and their brand Hyper Megatech. So far there have been 8 Superpockets and they are all largely identical, aside from the games included and the colour schemes. And I think it's safe to assume that they're quite popular as Blaze keep making them, and they do work as a good entry point for the Evercade ecosystem. A natural knock-on effect of this is that many people already into the Evercade don't get overly excited by each new release because they're not offering all that much in the way of new unique things, and that's fine. They don't need to appeal to everyone who's bought an Evercade, but they are a good budget option, and as the Taito Super Pocket proved, they can be a good tool for getting publishers on board for doing Evercade cartridges. One of the questions you might ask, though, is after 8 editions of the Super Pocket, how many more do we need? Is it time for Blaze to move on, or can they just keep pumping these out endlessly? And ultimately, I think the answer to that is, as long as they sell, they can keep on pumping them out. But for them to keep selling, they have to have a selling point, which obviously is the publisher attached to the specific devices. So bearing that in mind, what other publishers could Blaze make Super Pockets based around? Well, that's a big question, but I'm going to start with going through the Evercade cartridges and see which publishers they've dealt with before that potentially could do a Super Pocket. So I'm going to start from the earliest Evercade cartridges and work my way through. Now, I'm not going to name every single cartridge or ones that have already been done, just start with the earliest ones that haven't had a Super Pocket and go from there. And first up is a big one, Namco, and I think it's safe to say a Namco Super Pocket would go down very well, especially if it also led to there being more Namco Evercade carts. The 2 Namco carts on Evercade didn't even have any arcade originals on there, just the NES ports, or rather console ports. And they do have a wealth of arcade classics, not to mention a lot of console classics as well. So if a Namco Super Pocket could be in any way possible, it would be a huge get for Blaze, and I think it would go down really well. So moving on, and next we get to Interplay. It would very much be possible and would certainly have appeal to some people, but I don't think it's anywhere near as big a name as Namco, Neo Geo or what have you. I'm not convinced this will happen, to be perfectly honest, but yeah, maybe. And next up is Pico, and yeah, I don't see this happening. The Pico brand just doesn't have that level of recognition. But if it were to happen, and they included the best of the games that Pico own and a good quantity to entice people with the quantity of games inbuilt, then maybe it could do okay. But at a point of sale, Pico isn't going to do it, I don't think. So moving on, and the next thing we have is the Xenocrisis Tanglewood Dual Cart, so an indie dual cart or indie Super Pocket. And again, much like Pico, I'm not sure this has the sales draw to make it worthwhile, but what if they managed to secure a big name indie title? So let's say, for example, a Yacht Club Super Pocket, including Shovel Knight and Mina the Hollower. Again, I don't even know if that's even vaguely possible because they're not on Evercade, and whether they would run on the hardware, I don't know. So ultimately, I do think an indie-based Super Pocket is unlikely. Moving on, we have Oliver Twins, which would be Codemasters, that sort of thing, and I don't see that happening. EA ownership aside, I don't think there's much Codemasters-wise that has the level of sales draw internationally that Blaze would be looking for to do a Super Pocket. Especially as Blaze are soon to be releasing the home computer handhelds, and Codemasters are most famous for the home micros, so it just seems a little bit pointless and redundant. Well, that was a pointless and redundant statement. Well, the using of both words. Yeah. On that note, moving on, next up is Jaleco. And I think Jaleco is one of these borderline ones. The brand name isn't as well known as your Capcoms, your Neo Geos, or even your Data Easts, but it might just be enough to warrant one, maybe. So moving on, and I just realised I missed out Megacat, but they kind of fell onto the indie umbrella for me, and again, same sort of thing. So moving on again, and we have Worms, which would also be Team 17. And while Worms as a brand would be big enough, Team 17 also, but maybe less so. It has a sort of a double issue really. One, there is the home computer thing I mentioned, as that's where Team 17 were known for back in the day, although they're still going all strong today. But Worms on a Super Pocket, nah. There might be ways they could make something work, but yeah, I'm not sure I see it happening. So moving on, Galeco, as in the Galeco arcade collections. And I think these are quite possible. The Evercade does seem to be quite popular in Spain, and that's where Galeco were, well, that's where they're from and most known. But the two collections we have already do include the majority of the Galeco games. So really, I don't see it being outside the realms of possibility, but I also don't see it being all that likely to happen either. The Bitmap Brothers collection is the next card, and I mean, we've got two of those. I don't really see that happening as a Super Pocket. Again, not outside the realms of possibility, but I don't really see quite a big enough sales draw. So moving on to Intellivision, and I think that would be a no. Not impossible. I mean, not that it's impossible, but as a number of the games make use of the keypad thing and this, that, and the other, I don't see it being a great fit for the Super Pocket. So keeping going, Renovation Collection. I don't think there's a brand recognition at all here, although potentially could make for an interesting Super Pocket. I'm not convinced it would happen. And I'll apply all of that to a Gremlin Super Pocket. Not impossible, but yeah, I don't think I really see it happening. Okay, so going further on, and the next thing that comes up is the C64 Collection 1. And I don't see a C64 based Super Pockets happening because of the home computer handhelds. Same with an Amiga one or a Spectrum one. Yeah, I don't see it happening. So we get to the IREM Arcade Collection. And IREM, much like Namco, I think would be a huge one if they could get them to agree to doing a Super Pocket. There's a wealth of IREM games, and yeah, I think it would be a no-brainer if Blaze can make it happen. And next we have Toa Plan, and I don't see this happening. It's not impossible. Obviously there is a relationship there and all that, but too many of the Toa Plan games are Tate based, so unless they did a redesigned Super Pocket which had a better screen size and aspect ratio for those games, I really don't see it happening. So again, moving on, well, Sydney Hunter would fall under the whole indie thing, so I don't see that happening. Sunsoft might be a possibility, but I think falls into that sort of secondary. It could happen and it might do a right kind of thing, but I wouldn't really be an essential or a must-have or a huge draw, but enough of one in certain regions. Okay, so what about a Duke Nukem Super Pocket? Well, I think if it was going to happen, it probably would have by now, but between the remasters, Duke Nukem Advanced, and maybe they get something new and exclusive, I'm sure there's some other one that they could get on there. Maybe it could happen. Like I said, I just think maybe the time for that has passed, maybe. Similarly, a Tomb Raider Super Pocket, maybe it's a bit too specific and the games wouldn't be ideal on the hardware, so not impossible, but doesn't seem like the best idea. How about a Thalamus Super Pocket? Yeah, I think it just falls into that home micro thing, so yeah, I don't see it happening. Legacy of Kain, yeah, similar to Tomb Raider, I don't really see that happening. Same with Broken Sword. And really, after this point, most of the collections we've got are either things we've already covered or that there are already Super Pockets of. I'm not really sure I see a Llamasoft Super Pockets happening, although that could be amusing. So that's the existing publishers that Blaze have been dealing with covered. But what about people they haven't dealt with? I doubt many people would be against the idea of a Konami Super Pocket, or Sega for that matter, or Williams, Midway, and all that sort of thing. I mean, there's still a few publishers that Blaze haven't been able to get on board, so any of those, even if they just were hardware locked and just for Super Pockets or Alphas or whatever, if it's the only way to get them onto Evercade, as this has been the case for Capcom, well, I don't think people would complain too much, and it would give them hope that maybe carts could happen somewhere down the line, like it did with Taito. There is also another consideration for future Super Pockets, and that's multiple Super Pockets from a specific publisher. What if there was a second Capcom Super Pocket which had a whole different lineup of games? What if Konami was split up into like a Contra Super Pocket or a Castlevania Super Pocket and so on and so forth? Naturally, I think one of the reasons Blaze wouldn't do this is because, would be if they can't get carts for these things, that might cause a bit more frustration with the Evercade user base. But then maybe it could be used as a way to get things that require dual licensing vaguely into the Evercade system. So your Marvel and Capcom things. Maybe it'd result in a slightly more expensive Super Pocket. But then you could also imagine a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Super Pocket from Konami. There are potentially quite a few options along these lines, and I'm not going to go into all them all, but use your imagination. I'm sure you can think of a few things as well. Anyway, I've waffled and speculated long enough, so let's draw this to a close. So in an attempt to answer what is next for the Super Pocket, well, any of the things I've mentioned may be something unexpected. Should Blaze keep making Super Pockets? As I mentioned earlier, I think as long as they're selling, why not? But also maybe it's getting to the point where it's time for a change. Maybe it's time for them to retire the Super Pocket as it is and come up with another alternative budget or entry point for the Evercade ecosystem. Although what form that would take, I have no idea. I know there are some people who looked at the home micro handhelds and thought they would love to see an Evercade with it in like a clamshell case. And while that would be possible, I don't think it would be quite as budget or entry point as the Super Pockets. And of course you might be thinking, well, what would be the point of just doing a new handheld which is basically a replacement for the Super Pocket while they already have the existing design for the Super Pocket? Well, it would have to have something, some sort of draw or change, but potentially if they came up with something that was interesting enough, they could potentially go back to the licenses they've already done Super Pockets for and do new ones of this new product. A change is as good as a rest, and that would entice some of the people who maybe aren't buying every Super Pocket to check out this newer device. At the end of the day, Blaze are a hardware company, and they are going to keep churning out hardware. And while we as consumers don't have to buy everything they do, I certainly don't. I get the things that appeal to me and the ones that I want. But if they can find that want for people, yeah, they can rehash certain things. I mean, they're certainly not alone in doing it. A lot of these retro companies are doing the same things, often ad nauseum. And for the most part, I think Blaze find a nice balance. Unless you are really drawn into that, I've got to have it all, especially when the Super Pockets are numbered. That doesn't help some people. But I'm getting off topic, and I did say I was going to try and wrap this up. So my final thoughts on the Super Pocket line, whether it continues and that sort of thing. Well, I'm happy if it continues. I'm not sure if I'll ever buy another Super Pocket. I've got two, and that is quite enough. But if something comes along with enough of a draw for that specific product that makes me want to buy it, then who knows, maybe I will. Otherwise, I'm happy they're out there, and if they're selling and making more money for Blaze and helping them secure more licenses for the Evercade line, well, it's all good in my opinion. And that seems like a good place to wrap this up. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.